So let's start by talking about my topic, domain-driven design. I think that one reason you attend this talk or you watch this talk is that you know what that is. But in case you don't, I'm going to spend a few minutes on explaining my understanding of domain-driven design. I promise not to make this too long. Basically, what I will try to emphasize is what I think the core contributions of domain-driven design are, as Sven said. Because in fact, despite the title, I do like the concept. I do like the community. I like many of the members of this community, and I like a lot of the contributions. So let's talk a bit about what domain-driven design actually is. So this is my attempt at a definition. To me, this is an approach to designing software that puts the domain at the center. And that seems to be something that should be completely obvious. This should be the only way to build software. After all, why would you build software if you're not building it for the domain it's intended to serve, right? It seems completely obvious. But as you can see, I'm an old person. I've been in this business for a long time, and I have been part of a group of people that loves to play with technology. And I've seen lots and lots of projects that were based around a particular technological effort, around some tool that were motivated more by the interest of people to play with cool stuff, as opposed to focusing on the domain. So I think that is the core idea in domain-driven design. And another thing that I consider to be a core part is that what others in other communities consider to be something that should be separate from the software is a core part, or is the essential part of the software in domain-driven design, namely the model. So the idea that the model that you have of your domain actually is the core of the software system that you're building. The domain concepts that you typically express in a model are actually visible within the code that implements that domain logic. That's the other key part. That those are the two things that I consider very important. Of course, I'll give you the official definition as well. This is one from Eric Evans's domain-driven design reference. So Eric Evans is the author of the original book, which came out, I think, in 2003 or so. So in one of the updates to the terminology, he gave this definition, and it has a lot in common with what I just said. So focus on the core domain. Another important aspect to him is the collaboration between domain experts, domain practitioners, and technology or software practitioners. So we should work together, and we should have a shared understanding to arrive at this ubiquitous language, which is the idea that you have a common set of words that you don't have to translate between the terminology the software people use versus the one the domain people use. As a software person, it should be your goal to capture that language, to help the domain experts clear up that language and make it a core part of all of the concepts and components and building blocks that you have within your software system. So is that a good thing or not? I think this is a completely good thing. We probably can all agree that this sounds very good, and I definitely do think it sounds very good. When I read the book, I had an interesting, that was a long time ago, as I said. When I read the book, I had an interesting feeling that I've learned to recognize as something good. And that feeling is, well, yeah, that seems obvious. If you read a book and what's written there seems to be very obvious, then that's often the case that somebody took the time to actually write something down in a cohesive, a logical fashion that should be common knowledge, but often isn't. It might be obvious to you, it might not be obvious to other people. Not everything might be obvious to you, only parts of it might be. And establishing this shared understanding is, I think, a very good thing. I don't think Eric Evans would claim that he invented tons of new things. I don't think he ever did that. What he said was he derived a pattern language. He came up with a way of talking about things that was to him best practice at that point in time. And the key aspects in the book that resonated with me were three things. One was this ubiquitous language that we already talked about. I think that's an excellent concept. It changed many things for me, made me want to invent new terms less, made me want to understand why the domain people used the language they used. So I think that's a very good thing, and it's a very useful thing to have this agreed upon language. The second contribution of the book is one that I'm going to talk about a little bit more slightly later on, which is this idea of tactical patterns. Now, if you're building software, it doesn't really matter whether you do that in an object-oriented fashion or not, but especially if you're building object-oriented software, then you are familiar with certain patterns, such as a value object, or probably an entity object, those things were around before the book came out. They're not an invention by domain-driven design, but they are a key part of the book. They actually make up a major part of the book. And they serve as a set of patterns to help you structure and design your software system. So entity object, value object, service, repository, factory, those were things that had been there before. Module as well, it was elevated to the same level as a pattern here. Things like aggregate were a little more, I wouldn't say obscure, but a little more novel. But this was essentially the language, if you will, that Eric Evans came up with in his book. And again, this was not something that was completely new to me. We've been using similar terms in many projects, and I know that many other people were at the same time. So it was basically giving good names or assembling things with good names that were in common use. That's a technical view on the whole thing. And after the technical part, actually, there's another quite different part with this, which is the strategic part of domain-driven design in that book. And that's, I think, also an extremely important, to me, actually the more important part of domain-driven design. It also has a number of patterns, a number of concepts with names, like, for example, the bounded context, which to me is the key concept here, and a number of patterns for the relationships between bounded context and the teams that help build the software that implements that bounded context. I'm going to explain the term bounded context a little bit more on the next slide. But the key idea that I want to get across here is that, again, the book and the domain-driven design concept contains a number of those things, which are good and useful things to use when talking about relationships between contexts and teams. So what is this bounded context thing that I was talking about? A bounded context essentially is, well, a context within a certain part of the ubiquitous language, or if you will, a certain ubiquitous language holds true. So look at this example here. If you think of a larger system, then very often you end up decomposing it into, let's call them modules or subsystems or packages or building blocks. Within those building blocks, things may exist that seem the same as those in other building blocks. So in my example here, you see a product and a customer in my 3 different bounded contexts here. Within order management and accounting and fulfillment, those concepts exist, and they do have a relationship, but they're not the same. If you consider what a customer is from an accounting perspective, that's mostly a financial thing. It has financial relevance, whereas a customer from an order management perspective is more related to, creating an order and maybe tracking an order status and having some kind of, customer information to propose other things for them to order. Whereas in the fulfillment domain, the key thing might be the shipment address and the way they want their package delivered. These are just examples, right? But the point is that within those contexts, you get a certain level of isolation by agreeing what the domain terminology means within that particular context, as opposed to overall, which is sort of the absolute nightmare of every person who has to build software, in my view, which is that somebody went around the company and asked everybody, what do you think that a customer is? What do you think that a customer is? What do you think? And then adding attributes and responsibilities to a godlike customer object that some poor soul would then have to implement. Because trying to come up with one customer that serves everybody's needs is surely going to end up in a disaster. So this idea of separating things, again, was not an invention of domain-driven design, but it got a very cool name and a name that stuck. This bounded context concept is, to me, the single most important concept within all of domain-driven design, and the one that I really love to use in lots of places. So that all sounds good, I hope. I hope you don't think that I wanted to, paint things in bad light. I didn't want to do that. So I think these are all valuable contributions and useful things. So let's talk a bit about the problems that I have with some of those things. So the first one is that I really value conceptual extensibility. I really like this idea of having a language, right? So the idea that you have this language that you can use to talk to others about certain concepts is a very valuable thing. If you can agree on the domain language, that's really cool. But if you consider what a domain language is on our level, on the designer level, then there's certain, a certain way of meta level here, right? So let's think about this. If we generalize this whole concept, then this ubiquitous language also exists on the level of software design. So the patterns that I showed you themselves could be a ubiquitous language, right? The patterns that we're talking about here are the patterns of software design within the software design domain. We have entities and aggregates and values and contexts and partnership relationships and whatever, right? That's our language. Right? Well, the interesting thing here is that the same that I claimed was true for the domain that we typically think of is true for our domain as well. Would you really expect us to be able to walk around every software project in the world and come up with the one set of patterns that matches all of them? I, for one, wouldn't, because software projects are very different. I mean, they have different contexts, right? The contexts actually are we as software developers. So I think this language should really be more of a jargon kind of thing, right? It's a jargon within a certain context, within a certain community. So let's assume that all of us here work within a larger software project where maybe distributed across several teams. Then we have our own jargon on multiple levels. We have words that have meaning within each team. We also have words that have meaning across the teams. So for example, the ways we figure out on how to integrate our stuff, or how to do front end, or how to access the database or perform network communication, right? Those things are ways that we come up with and that change over the course of time. Once we discover a pattern, we actually use it. So the key thing that I want to get across here is that the set of predefined patterns is always only a starting point. It's not an end in itself. I don't think that Eric Evans ever wanted to claim that the set of patterns that he came up with was the one and only set of patterns that could ever be useful to anybody. Of course, why would he claim such a thing? He's a smart person, but some people take it extremely literally. They think that these things here are the patterns. If you do domain-driven design, then you have to use these things only, and you have to use them in exactly the way that the book describes them. Whereas my view is that this might be a great starting point. They might be perfectly fine for you, but you also might end up with your own language. You might add filters and rules and proxies and contracts and roles and reference, whatever it is that makes sense within your jargon, within your context language, right? So whatever makes sense to you, you add at this level. So that essentially means we're extending the technical patterns, but of course the same is true for the context relationships as well. So if you think of what these, if you're familiar with them, what they do, if you're not, I'll briefly explain them. What they do is they tell you the ways that contexts might be related. For example, one context owned by one team might be simply conforming to whatever interface another context prescribes. You have no say in that. They're more powerful than you. They define something. They may be an outside company or a standard product. Whatever they tell you the contract is the contract. That's the way you access their services or their interface, whatever it is they offer to you, right? So that's one way of a relationship. Another might be a partnership where it's more of a negotiation between equals. Or the relationship might be one where you actually share code, where you have a common piece of code that is available and used in both contexts. Right? Maybe not a good idea, but that's not the point. The point is that you can describe this relationship if it exists. And that's, again, very useful. It's a cool thing. You draw a context map, you visualize those dependencies, you can reason about them, you have some ways of dealing with them. So, for example, introducing an anti-corruption layer as a means of isolating yourself against changes. Those are all very good ideas. But again, there is a starting point, right? You might have something like a formal contract that might mean something very specific to you. You might have a shared spec or a third-party standard, or whatever it is, whatever kind of pattern makes sense to you. Again, you should be able to extend this as you see fit. So my criticism is not that the patterns are bad. I have some issues with some of them. I'm not a big fan of the aggregate pattern, but whatever. I mean, that's a discussion we can have if we ever work together in a project. But whatever makes sense to you within your project should be the kind of terminology and the kind of language that you come up with. In fact, we used to do this in a domain that is really, really not cool anymore. It's really not fashionable anymore. And it's the model-driven community, the model-driven architecture or model-driven development community, right? So if you have gray hair like me, then maybe you remember that was once a really cool thing. I don't think it's bad just because it's no longer fashionable. I don't think that is the solution to everything either, not at all. What I want to point out is that back in the day when we did that, we had a similar concept. We had a language on a meta level, a way to express models with certain stereotypes in, for example, UML. It was the same idea. It was the same concept. It's on the, from far away, this looks extremely similar to the whole thing. So that was my point number one that I wanted to make. The second one is about what domain-driven actually means. So I mentioned that I like the idea of being driven by the domain. In fact, I have a slide from a different slide deck that that talks about this common disease among developers. I hinted at that at the beginning, right? Domain allergy, that's a common thing. Weirdly enough, I find it's especially prevalent among software architects. I don't know why. I think software architects love to play with stuff. They love to figure out how technically complicated things work. So they sort of flee from the domain into the, I can say that because I am a software architect myself, right? So I'm always dissing myself as much as anybody else. So this idea that you can avoid getting to know the domain by, you know, taking refuge in technology is kind of a sad thing, but it happens. And domain-driven design wants to do things differently, and that's to be applauded. One of the ways it wants to do this is by having this very pure thing at the heart of the software system that you're building. So if you're developing in an object-oriented language, say Java or Scala or C#, then the idea is that you have this piece of code that really only has domain logic. Ideally, it has no dependency on any outside technical aspect at all. So whatever it is that your system needs to interface with, right? So here are some examples, like some kind of document store, the network, a database, the user interface, whatever it is, all of those things are external to your domain kernel, your domain logic, right? This domain logic in the center can live while can continue to provide value while the outside interfaces change. And the connection is made by a port. So you have certain ports, certain expectations typically. So your domain code might expect that there is something that can maybe talk to others, and then some implementation of that will connect it to an actual network interface, as just one example, right? So these adapters that are sort of on the outer perimeter here, they sort of translate between the technical details of some specific interface and the pure beauty of your internal model. And you've probably seen this under different names, right? So the shapes here suggest this is a hexagonal architecture. The name suggests it's ports and adapters. That's basically the same thing. You've also probably seen it as clean architecture. I haven't written it here, but I think it's basically not really different from a good layered architecture, but I'm willing to debate that point if you want to at the end. It's not very important to me. The key aspect to me here is this wonderful idea of having this really valuable code, right? This really business-focused, domain-focused, pure code. Now, if I were a mean person, and I'm not, then I would show you this slide. I'm going to be very brief with it, right? So, I mean, sometimes you figure out that your actual value lies somewhere else. I mean, this is something that might not look as cool if you draw a diagram, but sometimes you find out that there's a lot of actual value going on at the database layer or the user interface layer or some other layer of your application. And the domain logic is actually not that fancy. If the domain logic only provides, that sounds weird. How can the domain, let me rephrase that. The domain logic is always the most important part, but sometimes the domain logic is not best implemented in a pure object-oriented core model. Sometimes there are better solutions for implementing your domain model. So I think these are two different ways of talking about whether or not something should be domain-driven or not, right? So should design be domain-driven? Well, yes, of course, every design should be driven by the domain, should not be driven by technology. But if you understand something different when you hear domain-driven design, then I would say, no, not every software needs to be built using a technology-neutral, object-oriented core. Again, this does not mean that I have a problem with any of that. I like object orientation, maybe not as much as I did 20 years ago, but I still like it. I think it's a good concept. And again, if you look at the way people programmed and sometimes still program Smalltalk today, then I think they had these same concepts. They had this idea of a ubiquitous language. They wanted to capture domain concepts within the classes and messages they sent. They built beautiful systems that had a lot of these attributes. So that is a cool thing and something that you can absolutely do, but you don't have to do it every time. So let me offer you some alternatives or some other ways you could go about building your domain logic. One would be, God forbid, actually using your relational database. This might come as a surprise to some domain-driven design practitioners, but relational databases are actually pretty cool, pretty mature technology. They're very, very useful. If your application is data-driven, then actually modeling your data in terms of tables and views and relationships between them, and indexes, foreign key constraints, and all of that, you actually end up with something that's really, really maintainable, that really, really has super high performance because it does what a database is good at. So sometimes this might be an excellent choice for your application. In fact, I've seen and been confronted with a lot of applications that naively wanted to implement as much as possible within the OO layer and made it and had disastrous performance because they created tons of N+1 problems when interacting with the database, did lots of things in memory that could have been done on the database layer, created lots of problems, all in the name of a better architecture. And it's kind of weird that you want to do the right thing, that you want to follow a clean architecture, and end up with something that's actually pretty dirty, because you end up having to tweak and do lots of little tricks in some places. So again, I'm not suggesting this is the best model. You know, there's a guy I really recommend called Lukas Eder on Twitter. You can find him very easily. He writes the GOTO library, which is fantastic to access a relational database as a relational database, as opposed to hiding it behind some fancy OO mechanism. And he's somebody who would say this is almost always the best you can do. So if you want that opinion, follow him. I'm just pointing it out as one very useful opinion that you could have and that you could use. Okay, so Sean Underwood writes that he's also seen that approach lead to really thorny data integrity challenges. That's true. I mean, I'm actually not sure whether Sean's referring to the one I'm proposing here or the one I propose as an alternative, because it's true. It can be true in both, right? It can be true in the hybrid approach as well as in the pure relational approach. So you'll absolutely have to watch out what you're doing here. And I'm not a fan of giant messes of PL SQL stored procedures in some messy Oracle database either, right? So it all has its place. Okay, so that was number one. Suggestion number two, drive it from the UI, drive it from the user experience, drive it from the user. I mean, sometimes you're not in the phase where you have stable domain logic and domain experts to talk to, because domain experts don't exist yet, because you're building something completely new. Maybe you're building software for a startup that needs to figure out what it is that the market wants. You're definitely not in a phase where you're creating a stable model for the next decade that you will use in tons of applications. You're in a phase where you want to iterate really, really quickly and build something that can get it in front of actual users as quickly as possible. I would say user interface matters much more than many architects think. And I think user interface, the actual way you connect to the actual domain users, is a way of viewing domain-driven as well, right? I think this is actually what's most important to your actual end users. So you should assign a lot of importance to that. Again, is this the only thing? Of course not. So consider it as something that you might want to do in many occasions. Personally, I think that front-end development and user-centric development and UI development doesn't get the credit it deserves in large parts of our industry. So I think we should invest more. Everybody should know a little bit of that. So probably you should do more rather than less of this. But again, I'm just pointing it out as one particular alternative that you could use to this domain-driven OO core design thing. But maybe that's not your thing. Maybe you don't really have a user interface issue here. Maybe you have a really, really complex piece of business logic. Maybe it's really all of the complex relationships between domain concepts that really, really create the value here. So maybe then the domain-driven OO design core is the right thing. Or maybe you could go with this one. This is an alternative. I had the pleasure to do 2 podcasts, one in German, one in English, one with my colleague Lars Huppel, one with Mike. Did I do both? I think I did both in English for the case podcast. So they both suggested something that actually is a way more mathematical. They're both very much into functional programming. So their model is you try to map your domain into a cohesive grammar, a cohesive algebra that really connects the concepts using rules that actually make mathematical sense or are similar to something that you are used to from other mathematical branches. And then you actually discover new domain concepts by applying the logic within that algebra, right? So if something is combinable according to your rules, you try that out. And that's maybe something that that no domain expert has ever thought of being able to be combined. But once you do that and talk to them, look, could we do it this way? They say, oh, wow, this looks kind of cool. We didn't think of that. So you actually abstract things to a different level. You abstract things to this mathematical model, which I'm pretty sure won't have entities and aggregates and value objects, right? That's a different way of designing a software here. You maybe have different ways of permutations or combinations, right? Thanks, Sven, for the link in the chat regarding the podcast episodes. So this might be an option, or maybe you want to go with this one. Maybe you don't have this single deployment term. You don't have this single software way of expressing your things. Maybe you're in a domain where your programming language that's available to you isn't powerful enough to do that. Maybe you don't have an O language at your disposal. Maybe you're programming in C on an embedded system, right? Or maybe you have to program the same thing for multiple environments. So maybe you will go with such a model-driven approach where you actually end up having a model separate from the software, because that is what provides the most value to your specific scenario. I'm not suggesting that any of these things is better than this domain-driven OO design or domain-driven design core, right? I'm not suggesting that. In fact, I think domain-driven design actually has a great solution for this concept, which is this context concept. So I talked about those contexts. If we look again at the definition of a bounded context, then a bounded context is something where a particular model is defined and applicable. So in my example that I had at the beginning of this presentation, I had these three bounded contexts with the order management model, the accounting model, and the fulfillment model that all have their own validity within that particular context. And you could view that and extend it to include the choice of technology, right? You could decide to implement things differently within each of those contexts and decide that the relational model works best for your accounting scenario here, whereas the UX-driven one works best for the order management, and the tactical DDD one works best as an implementation strategy for the fulfillment domain. I don't really care. This is just an example, right? This does not attempt to actually suggest that this is a good choice for those particular bounded contexts. I'm just pointing out that you don't have to do things the same way in all of those contexts. So, is DDD overrated? I think that strategic DDD is an excellent starting point. In fact, I use that almost all the time. Sometimes I call it strategic DDD. Sometimes I don't use that terminology. Sometimes I use the word bounded context. Sometimes I don't. In fact, I've been doing that for far longer than domain-driven design exists, which is not supposed to sound like an arrogant statement or mean that domain-driven design does not create a lot of value. I think it creates a lot of value in this regard. So this is a good thing. Tactical DDD, I view slightly less favorably. I think it's a good starting point as well, but it's best viewed as a micro-level decision. I mean, this is one way of implementing systems, and it's really on a different level. I'm not sure it should be part of the same discussion, right? This is a different thing. You can build excellent systems in a domain-driven way, I think, or you can claim that you're doing domain-driven design, even if you don't ever use any of the stereotypes mentioned in the tactical DDD part of the book or in any of those discussions. I really appreciate DDD and its community, right? I want to make that clear. Right? I like the people there. I respect them a lot. I have fantastic discussions with many of them. Some of my colleagues are very vocal parts of that community, and that's perfectly fine. I don't want to, do the typical these guys are all stupid and I knew it all along. Not at all. But I think sometimes there's the tendency to view this one solution as the only viable one, which sort of leads me to my summary. I think just in general, as general advice, no matter what the particular topic is, you shouldn't be looking for just one thing. Maybe that's something, if you're just entered this domain, then it'll take a while. If you've been here for a while, you probably know that already. Pretty sure you do. No single approach will match your needs in 100% of the cases, or even 50% of the cases, right? Everything you learn is an addition to your tool set. It is something that you might be able to use. You might know some things very well, others not so well, but still you should have a large tool set to be able to choose something that matches the particular needs. Unless your day job is being a speaker at conferences who talks about one particular topic. I mean, then that's a different thing. Then you can pick one and just stick to that. But if you're a general purpose practitioner who builds actual systems for a domain, then probably you need more than one approach. Recipes are fantastic starting points. So Specifically, especially if you're starting something from scratch and don't have a lot of experience, then you might want to follow the recipe more closely. Some dogma might actually be valuable, right? At that part of your learning curve. It's the same as with a cooking recipe, right? When you're doing it for the first time, you probably follow the recipe more closely than when you're cooking the dish for the 10th time. Then you'll do a lot more variation depending on your character. You might start with the first recipe in a completely different way, whatever, it doesn't really matter, right? So the following rules at the start is fine, but don't continue to be dogmatic in the long run. And I think, to me, the most important thing is use those contexts, which are the most valuable contribution, as sort of decision spheres. Use them to give you a boundary within which you can decide differently from all the others. And that's, I think, a very useful thing to do and will help you with a lot of decisions. Okay, that's all I have.